The cold air in the interrogation room was a physical thing, a heavy blanket that smelled of stale coffee and desperation. Kim sat perfectly still, her hands resting flat on the pitted metal table, a stark contrast to the frantic energy buzzing just beyond the one-way mirror. She knew they were there. Her father, Robert, with his posture of manufactured gravitas. Her mother, Helen, performing her role as the grief-stricken matriarch, dabbing at dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. And Mark, her brother, the golden child, the architect of this nightmare, likely staring at her with that familiar blend of pity and contempt. They had done this. They had taken the messy, tangled threads of their own corruption and woven them into a net, casting it over her with the casual cruelty of people swatting a fly. The lead detective, a man named Garcia whose ambition was poorly concealed beneath a weary exterior, slid a folder onto the table. It landed with a soft thud that echoed the final closing of a door on her old life. "Let's go over this one more time, Kim," Garcia said, his voice a low, tired drone. "On the 5th of last month, a wire transfer of $200,000 was made from your family's corporate account to an offshore entity. 2 days later, a whistleblower sends an anonymous tip to the SEC with a data packet implicating you. The packet contains emails, forged authorizations, server logs. All of it originating from an IP address traced back to the guest house on your parents' property, where you were staying." He leaned forward, the smell of cheap mints washing over her. "It's a clean narrative. A disgruntled daughter, feeling cut out of the family fortune, siphons off a little retirement fund for herself and tries to burn the whole company down on her way out. Your parents are devastated. Your brother is beside himself. They can't understand how their own flesh and blood could do this." Kim met his gaze without flinching. Her pulse was a slow, steady drumbeat, a rhythm she had trained for years to control. Inside, a cold fire was simmering. Disgruntled daughter. It was almost laughable. She had walked away from their world of manicured lawns and hollow smiles a decade ago, not out of spite, but for survival. She had chosen a life of purpose, a life they couldn't possibly comprehend and had therefore dismissed as a failure. A low-level administrative job in a forgotten government department, they'd called it. They had painted her as a gray, unremarkable person, and in their arrogance they believed their own caricature. That arrogance was now their greatest vulnerability. "I didn't do it," she said, her voice even. "The evidence has been fabricated." Garcia sighed, a theatrical display of exasperation. "Of course it has. Everyone in this chair has a story. The problem is your family's story is better. They have records, timelines, a motive. You have, what exactly? A flat denial. You won't even confirm your employment details, citing some vague confidentiality agreement. It makes you look guilty as sin." He was right. She was offering them nothing. It was the hardest part of her training, the discipline of silence, of allowing the perception of weakness to be your shield. Her entire career was built on the bedrock of anonymity, of being the person no one ever saw coming. Now, that same training was being used as a noose around her neck. She could feel the weight of their collective will pressing down on her, the weight of a family narrative she had never been a part of but was now the designated villain of. She thought of her father, the man who taught her how to play chess and then criticized every move she made. She remembered her mother's brittle affection, a currency given for conformity and withdrawn for independence. And Mark. He had always been the sun around which their family orbited, and she, a distant, forgotten moon. She'd seen the desperation in his eyes during her last visit home, the slight tremble in his hand as he signed a purchase order, the way he flinched at the sound of his phone. She had been there to investigate those tremors, to follow the cracks in their perfect facade. She just never imagined the fault line would lead directly back to her. The door to the interrogation room opened, and a junior officer leaned in. "Detective, they're here." Garcia straightened up, a flicker of something annoyance, maybe intrigue, in his eyes. "Who's here?" But the officer just widened his eyes and stepped back, holding the door open. 2 individuals, a man and a woman, stepped inside. They were dressed in unremarkable suits that somehow seemed perfectly tailored, their movements economical and precise. They didn't look at Garcia, they looked at her. The man, who had a calm, authoritative presence, gave her a nearly imperceptible nod. It was the signal. The waiting was over. The weeks leading up to her arrest had been a masterclass in familial deceit, though she hadn't fully appreciated the artistry of it at the time. It had all started with a phone call from her mother, Helen, her voice dripping with uncharacteristic warmth. "Kim, darling, it's been too long. Your father and I were just saying how much we miss you. The cherry blossoms are in bloom. You always loved the cherry blossoms." It was a summons, cloaked in sentimentality. Kim, whose real work involved tracking the subtle digital footprints of international criminals, recognized the anomaly in her mother's tone immediately. Her family didn't miss her. They tolerated her absence. Her visits were rare, usually confined to major holidays where her quiet presence served as a useful, drab backdrop to Mark's glittering successes. An impromptu invitation to see flowers was a deviation from the established pattern, and in her line of work, deviations were everything. She agreed to come, of course. Her assignment was to get closer. The Bureau had flagged irregularities in her family's import-export business, whispers of shell corporations and sanitized ledgers that hinted at a much larger operation. For months, Kim had been on the periphery, building a case from a distance. The invitation was the break she needed, a chance to get inside the network, to observe the principals in their natural habitat. She arrived on a Tuesday, stepping out of a modest sedan into the sprawling, manicured world of her childhood. The house stood as it always had, a monument to her father's ambition, all gleaming windows and imposing columns. Robert greeted her with a handshake, his grip firm, his eyes appraising her as if she were a piece of inventory. "Good of you to make it, Kim. You're looking well." The unspoken addendum hung in the air. "For you." Helen swept her into a cloud of expensive perfume, her embrace brief and patting, a gesture more for an audience than for connection. "Darling, we'll put you in the guest house. You always liked your privacy." The guest house. It was a perfect, isolated bubble complete with its own Wi-Fi network, a detail that in retrospect was chillingly deliberate. Her brother Mark was the last to greet her. He clapped her on the shoulder, his smile wide and practiced. "Hey, sis, welcome home. It's been a while." Big shot government agent gracing us with her presence. He'd laughed, but his eyes were tight, watchful. The prodigal son, the CEO in waiting, looked like a man carrying an immense weight. During that first dinner, the performance was flawless. They asked about her life with a polite, surface-level interest they never actually possessed. They spoke of her drab apartment in a distant city, her quiet, single life, her supposedly menial job. Every question was a subtle affirmation of their narrative. She was the one who had failed to launch, the one who existed outside their circle of success. Kim played her part, offering vague, self-deprecating answers. She spoke of budgets and paperwork, of the slow, grinding machinery of government bureaucracy. It was the perfect cover, so dull it repelled further inquiry. While they saw a failure, she was observing, cataloging. She noticed the new Rolex on Mark's wrist, a model far too extravagant for the company's declared profits. She saw the way her mother deflected any talk of business finances, quickly changing the subject to a recent charity gala. She watched her father, who, despite his confident bluster, had developed a nervous habit of tapping his fingers on the table whenever a specific shipping route was mentioned. The house itself felt different, stretched thin with a tension that hummed just beneath the surface of their polite conversation. One night, feigning a headache, she'd slipped out of a family gathering and made her way to the main house's study. Using a micro device that mimicked a standard USB charger, she began a data clone of her father's primary desktop. It was risky, but necessary. As the data flowed, she heard footsteps. She pulled the device just as Mark entered the room. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his eyes immediately flicking to the computer. She held up a book from the shelf. "Just looking for something to read." "This place is like a library." Mark didn't smile. "Yeah, Dad's a real collector. You should be careful, though. Some of his things are very valuable." The warning was clear. This was his territory. Later that week, she'd used the guest house Wi-Fi to run a deep dive search on a name she'd overheard Mark muttering on the phone. It was a foolish mistake, a moment of operational laziness she would come to regret. She had underestimated their technical savvy, assuming their corruption was old-fashioned, all paper trails and backroom handshakes. She didn't realize they had their own expert, someone capable of isolating her activity and turning her own digital breadcrumbs into a path leading straight to a prison cell. The trap hadn't been set for a random intruder. It had been custom-built for her, using her presence as the final, crucial component. The day before she was scheduled to leave, her mother had insisted on taking her to lunch, a rare one-on-one event. It was there, over salads they barely touched, that Helen had delivered the final, poignant touch. "I worry about you, Kim," she'd said, her voice soft with practiced sincerity. "You seem so adrift. I know we haven't always seen eye to eye, but you're still my daughter. If you ever needed anything at all, you know you could come to us, don't you?" It was a preemptive absolution, a final coat of paint on their masterpiece of betrayal. They weren't just framing a criminal, they were framing their lost, struggling daughter, a fiction that would be so much more palatable to a jury. When she'd returned to the guest house, her laptop, which she had left powered down, was warm to the touch. "The account the money was wired to is in the Cayman Islands," Detective Garcia was saying, his voice pulling her back to the suffocating present of the interrogation room. "But it was set up using a series of encrypted emails. Our tech guys managed to peel back a few layers. They found metadata fragments, digital signatures that bounced through a dozen proxies before they were anonymized. But the origin point, the very first keyboard they touched, matches the unique hardware ID of the laptop we found in your possession." He slid a photograph across the table. It was her personal laptop, the one she'd brought from home, sitting on the desk in the guest house. "Your brother, Mark, found it after you left. Said he went in to make sure you hadn't forgotten anything. He saw it was still on and got a bad feeling. He called their IT guy, who did a preliminary scan and immediately called the police. Very civic-minded of him." Kim looked at the photo, her face a placid mask. Inside, she was methodically deconstructing their plan. It was sophisticated. They hadn't just planted files, they had cloned her hardware ID and spoofed her digital signature, creating a ghost image of her online presence and grafting it onto their crimes. It was the kind of work that required more than just motive. It required expertise. Mark must have hired a professional. This was no amateur hack job. "I'm telling you, that evidence is not what it seems," she stated calmly. "Forensic data can be manipulated." Garcia scoffed, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms. The posture was meant to be intimidating, a signal that he was done listening. "Manipulated. Right. So let me get this straight. Your brother, a respected businessman, your father, a pillar of the community, and your mother, a woman who broke down in tears describing how she tried to help her troubled daughter, all conspired to learn advanced cybercrime techniques to frame you for a crime they committed. And for what? What's the motive?" He was baiting her, trying to get her to spin a wild, unbelievable story that would only make her look more unstable. She wouldn't take it. Her orders were clear. Do not reveal your status unless compromised or cleared by your handler. Until Agent Davies had walked through that door a few moments ago, she was on her own. She had to hold the line, even if it meant letting them think she was guilty. "I can't give you all the details right now," she said, choosing her words with surgical precision. "But I am part of a confidential federal investigation. My presence at my family's home was not a social visit." A loud, derisive laugh erupted from Garcia. "Oh, this is rich, a confidential investigation. Into what? The quality of the catering at their country club. Listen, Kim, I've been a cop for 15 years. I've heard every excuse in the book. The secret agent one is a classic, but it never holds up. You have no credentials, no one to vouch for you, and a mountain of evidence against you. We have your family's testimony. We have the data. The district attorney is already drafting the indictment." He leaned in again, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But you can still help yourself. Give us a full confession. Tell us you were desperate for the money. Maybe you had debts. We can talk to the DA, maybe get you a lighter sentence. Show some remorse. Your mother is hoping you'll do the right thing." Remorse. The word was a bitter pill. They wanted her to show remorse for a crime they had committed, to validate their fiction by crying on cue. They wanted to destroy her and then have her thank them for it. The thought was so grotesquely intimate, so uniquely cruel that it almost broke through her composure. A flicker of rage, hot and pure, licked at the edges of her control. She took a slow, deep breath, centering herself. She thought of her training, of the long hours spent in simulated high-stress scenarios, learning to detach, to observe, to wait for the opportune moment. The moment was coming. She could feel it. The arrival of the two agents was the first tremor. Garcia didn't know it yet, but the ground was about to split wide open beneath his feet. He was a bit player in a drama he didn't even know he was auditioning for, and his part was nearly over. Kim looked past him, toward the one-way mirror, picturing her family on the other side. She imagined the smug satisfaction on Mark's face, the practiced sorrow on her mother's. They thought they had won. They had caged the black sheep, solidifying their own story of victimhood. They had no idea the cage wasn't for her. It was for them. And the door was about to be locked from the outside. From their vantage point in the observation room, Helen, Robert, and Mark watched the scene unfold with a carefully managed blend of anxiety and triumph. The room was small and smelled of burnt coffee and disinfectant, a stark contrast to the luxurious comfort they were accustomed to. Helen dabbed her eyes with her handkerchief, a purely theatrical gesture now, her gaze fixed on the silent image of her daughter. "She looks so cold," she whispered, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. "I don't even recognize her anymore. How could she do this to us, Robert? After everything we've given her." Robert placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, his expression a mask of paternal sorrow. "She made her choice, Helen. She was always different. We have to be strong now for the company, for the family." Inside, however, Robert was a knot of raw nerves. The plan had been Mark's creation, a high-stakes gamble born of desperation, but he had signed off on it. He had watched his son, the heir he had poured all his hopes into, meticulously craft the digital cage for his own sister. He justified it as a necessary evil, a surgical amputation to save the body of the family business, which was bleeding out from years of Mark's reckless decisions and his own willful blindness. The company was a house of cards, and one strong gust of wind, an audit, a serious inquiry would bring it all down. Framing Kim was their human shield. Who would look deeper into a simple case of familial embezzlement, especially when the family itself was so heartbroken, so cooperative? Mark stood slightly apart from them, his arms crossed, his jaw tight. He avoided looking at his sister, focusing instead on the detective. He had done it. He had pulled them back from the brink. The weight of his failures, the bad investments, the cooked books, the constant pressure to live up to his father's expectations had been crushing him. Kim's visit had been an unexpected gift. Her opaque government job, her disconnected life, her quiet strangeness, it all made her the perfect scapegoat. He had hired a dark web contractor, a digital ghost who, for a hefty price, had mirrored Kim's laptop, created the false trails, and planted the evidence so seamlessly that it was indistinguishable from the real thing. It was a work of art, and Mark felt a perverse sense of pride. He had saved them. He had protected the legacy. He had proven once and for all that he was the capable son, the one who could make the hard decisions. A brief, ugly memory surfaced. Kim, as a teenager, beating him at chess. She had been methodical, patient, seeing moves he never anticipated. He had swept the pieces from the board in a fit of rage. This time, he had swept her off the board entirely. A sudden commotion at the end of the hall broke the tense silence. Two uniformed officers snapped to attention as two people in dark suits walked past with an air of brisk, untroubled authority. Mark felt a prickle of unease. They didn't look like local law enforcement. They moved with a different kind of purpose. "Who are they?" Helen asked, her voice sharp with anxiety. Robert shrugged, but his eyes narrowed. "Probably DA's office, or feds following up on the SEC tip. It's just a formality." But Mark knew better. A formality didn't command that kind of silent deference from uniformed cops. He watched as they spoke briefly with a senior officer, who then pointed them directly toward Kim's interrogation room and the observation room they were currently in. A cold dread began to seep into his veins. The plan was perfect. It was airtight, but it was designed to withstand the scrutiny of a small-town police department, not this, whatever this was. The door to their observation room opened without a knock. The woman from the suited pair stood there. She was young, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to take in the entire room, and the three of them in a single, dismissive glance. "Robert, Helen, and Mark," she asked, though it wasn't a question. "We need this room. You can wait in the main reception area." Her tone was flat, non-negotiable. "I beg your pardon," Robert began, his voice puffing with indignation. "We are the victims here. We were told we could observe." "You were told incorrectly." The agent cut him off, her voice like ice. "Wait outside." She stepped aside, holding the door, and her male partner walked past her and into the observation room, his gaze fixed on the interrogation next door. He completely ignored them. The power dynamic in the building had just shifted, and the fulcrum was no longer Detective Garcia or the local DA. It was these two silent, imposing figures. A knot of panic tightened in Mark's chest. He exchanged a look with his father, whose face had gone pale. Helen, for the first time, looked genuinely frightened, her performance dissolving into raw fear. They shuffled out of the room, reduced from aggrieved victims to mere bystanders. As the door clicked shut behind them, Mark could see the male agent speaking into a small communication device in his cuff, his eyes still locked on Kim. The certainty Mark had felt just minutes before was rapidly crumbling, replaced by a terrifying thought, one that had been buried deep beneath his arrogance. What if they had been wrong about her? What if the quiet, gray, unremarkable sister he thought he knew was someone else entirely? The idea was so preposterous he almost laughed, but the sound that caught in his throat was a choked gasp of fear. They weren't just observing an interrogation anymore. They were witnessing the activation of a system they couldn't comprehend, and they had just painted a target on their own backs. The shift inside the precinct was palpable, a change in atmospheric pressure that preceded a storm. Local detectives who had been swaggering with the confidence of an open and shut case now stood in hushed, anxious clusters, stealing glances at the two newcomers who had commandeered their station with quiet, unassailable authority. Detective Garcia, who had been orchestrating the interrogation, now found himself an unwelcome spectator in his own room. He stood awkwardly against the wall as the male agent, who introduced himself brusquely as Davies, took his seat opposite Kim. The female agent, Harris, stood by the door, a silent sentinel. The one-way mirror, which had been a tool for the family's voyeuristic justice, now felt like a lens pointed the wrong way, exposing the provincialism of the local department. Davies placed a slim, government tissue briefcase on the table and opened it. He didn't pull out weapons or intimidating gadgets, just a single, thin file folder. He opened it and read for a moment, his expression unreadable. The profound silence in the room was a stark contrast to Garcia's earlier blustering. Kim, for her part, remained perfectly composed, but a subtle tension had eased from her shoulders. Her allies had arrived. She was no longer an island. Davies finally looked up, his gaze bypassing Garcia entirely and settling on Kim. "I trust your time in local custody has been tolerable, Agent," he said, his voice calm and professional. Garcia's jaw practically hit the floor. He looked back and forth between the stone-faced federal agent and the quiet woman he had been threatening with a lengthy prison sentence for the past 4 hours. "Agent," Garcia stammered, taking a step forward. "What the hell is going on?" "This woman is a suspect in a major fraud and embezzlement case." Agent Harris turned her head slightly, her gaze pinning Garcia to the wall. "Detective, your participation in this matter is concluded. You are welcome to stay and observe, but you will not speak unless spoken to." The dismissal was so complete, so absolute, that Garcia physically deflated, shrinking back against the wall with a look of stunned disbelief. Davies turned his attention back to Kim. "We intercepted the final packet of falsified data an hour ago. The contractor your brother hired is a known player from Minsk. He's good at what he does, but he has a digital tell, a specific recursive loop in his anonymizer code. We've been tracking him for months in connection with another case. When your family's company pinged on our financial watch list 6 months ago, we tasked you with the initial reconnaissance. Your visit was phase 1 of the operation, asset identification and proximity assessment." He paused, letting the information settle. "When you went dark and the local PD flagged your arrest, we immediately cross-referenced the case files. The contractor's digital signature was all over the evidence they have on you. Your brother wasn't just trying to frame you. He inadvertently used a cybercriminal who was already under active federal surveillance." A ghost of a smile touched Kim's lips. It was a rookie mistake, born of arrogance. Mark had gone looking for a ghost online and had found one that was already being haunted by a much bigger machine. "The timing of my arrest must have accelerated your timeline," Kim stated, her voice now carrying a crisp, professional edge that had been absent before. "Considerably," Davies confirmed. "We were planning a slow, methodical takedown. Your family's little melodrama has forced our hand." He closed the file and slid it across the table to her. "This is your official exoneration and a summary of our case against them. It includes the original SEC flags, our surveillance logs from the past 6 months, and a full forensic breakdown of the fabricated evidence. The U.S. Attorney's Office is unsealing the federal indictment as we speak." Out in the reception area, the atmosphere was thick with a new kind of dread. Robert's attempts to get information from the desk sergeant were met with a polite but firm stone wall. "I have no information for you at this time, sir. Please have a seat." Helen had stopped her weeping act and was now twisting her diamond rings around her finger, her face a mask of genuine panic. Mark was pacing, his phone clutched in his hand as he frantically tried to reach their lawyer, who wasn't answering. Every instinct in his body was screaming at him that something was terribly wrong. His airtight plan, his salvation, was unraveling at an astonishing speed. He had built a fortress, but he hadn't accounted for an attack from the sky. The door to the hallway opened, and Detective Garcia walked out, his face pale and his movements stiff. He didn't look at them. He walked straight to his desk, sat down heavily, and stared blankly at his computer screen, a man whose entire world had just been upended. Robert approached him cautiously. "Detective, what is it? What's happening with our daughter?" Garcia looked up at him, and for the first time there was no sympathy in his eyes, only a deep, simmering contempt. "She's not your daughter anymore," he said, his voice a low growl. "She's their agent, and you people, you are in a world of trouble you can't even begin to imagine." Before Robert could process the words, Agent Harris appeared at the doorway. "The U.S. Attorney's Office has authorized us to inform you," she said, her voice devoid of any emotion. "Robert, Helen, and Mark, you are all under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, falsifying evidence in a federal investigation, and obstruction of justice. Please stand up and place your hands behind your backs." The words descended like a guillotine. Helen let out a small, strangled shriek. Robert staggered back, his face a mess of confusion and terror. But Mark just froze, his eyes wide with the horrifying, crystal-clear realization of his mistake. He hadn't just framed his sister. He had tried to frame the United States government. The interrogation room door swung open, but it was not to lead Kim away in handcuffs. Instead, Agent Davies stood and offered her a small, professional smile. "Welcome back, Special Agent Kim," he said, the formality a stark acknowledgement of the ordeal she had just endured. The title, spoken aloud in this place of accusation, was a vindication so profound it almost buckled her knees. She had lived under the weight of her family's dismissive narrative for so long. Kim, the quiet one, Kim, the disappointment, Kim, the federal suspect, that hearing her true identity affirmed was like taking her first breath after being held underwater. She stood, her movements steady, and nodded. "Thank you, sir. It's good to be back." As she stepped out into the main bullpen of the precinct, a hush fell over the room. The local officers, who had earlier looked at her with a mixture of pity and scorn, now averted their eyes, their faces a mixture of awe and embarrassment. She saw Garcia at his desk, staring into his coffee cup as if it held the answers to the universe. He had been a pawn, just as she had been, in a game whose rules he never understood. Her family was being processed nearby. The sounds were a chaotic symphony of their downfall. Helen was sobbing, real tears this time, tears of pure, unadulterated fear as a female officer methodically emptied the contents of her designer handbag into a plastic bin. Her carefully constructed world of charity luncheons and social prestige was being inventoried and sealed away. Robert, his face the color of ash, was struggling with the fingerprinting machine, his hands trembling too much to provide a clean print. The patriarch, the pillar of the community, was being reduced to a set of smudged lines on a card. And then there was Mark. He stood silent and rigid as he was being read his rights, his eyes locked on her. The smug superiority was gone, replaced by a hollow look of utter devastation. In his eyes, she saw the full, crushing weight of his miscalculation. He hadn't just lost his freedom, he had lost the narrative he had built his entire life upon. He was not the savior of the family, he was its executioner. She felt a surprising pang, not of pity, but of something more complex, a sad, clinical recognition of a life wasted on arrogance and jealousy. Davies led her to a quiet conference room, away from the prying eyes of the local force. "The U.S. attorney will handle the rest," he explained, pouring her a cup of water. "They'll be transported to a federal holding facility within the hour. The case against them is overwhelming. We have the contractor from Minsk. He flipped the moment we showed him an extradition order. He gave us everything, his complete correspondence with your brother, the payment transfers, the source code for the framing software. Mark didn't just leave a trail, he left a 4-lane highway pointing directly at himself. Kim took a sip of water, the cool liquid a small comfort in the lingering chill of the interrogation room. And the business, the original fraud. Worse than we thought, Davies said, his expression grim. They weren't just cooking the books to cover debts. They were laundering money for an Eastern European syndicate. The import-export business was a front, washing millions in illicit funds through fraudulent shipping manifests and inflated invoices. Your brother got in over his head. The syndicate was squeezing him, threatening to expose him. Framing you for a lesser crime of embezzlement was his desperate, harebrained scheme to create a smokescreen, to sacrifice you to save himself from much bigger predators. The revelation landed with a dull thud. It wasn't just about greed or covering up bad investments. It was rot, all the way to the core. They had been willing to send her to prison not just to save their lifestyle, but to appease violent criminals. The thought was sickening. Her own family had weighed her life against their criminal enterprise and found her disposable. Agent Harris is securing their residence, Davies continued. We'll have teams going through every inch of that house and their corporate offices by morning. Your father and mother are complicit. We have financial records showing their active participation in the laundering scheme, dating back years. Helen's charity galas were a primary vehicle for washing the cash. He paused, his professional tone softening for a moment. This can't be easy, Kim. I know they're your family. Kim looked down at her hands, still resting on the table as they had been for hours. They were steady. They stopped being my family the moment they decided my freedom was a fair price for their secrets, she said, her voice quiet but firm. My only regret is that the institution I work for had to be the one to expose it. It feels complicated. Davies nodded in understanding. Justice is rarely clean, but it's necessary. You did your job, Kim. You held the line, even when your own blood was trying to bury you. There's no higher honor in this line of work. He told her a car was waiting to take her to a secure debriefing facility. She would be given leave, access to counseling, and a commendation for her conduct under extreme duress. Her life as a field agent was, for now, on hold, but her career was secure. More than secure, it was solidified. As she stood to leave, she glanced through the conference room window back at the bullpen. She saw Mark being led away in handcuffs. He looked up, and his eyes met hers one last time. In them, she saw a flicker of the little boy she used to build forts with in the backyard, a boy who had long since been consumed by the man he became. For a fleeting second, she felt the ghost of a loss, the mourning for a bond that had been corrupted beyond recognition. Then she turned away and walked out the door, leaving the wreckage of her old life behind. The fallout was swift and brutal, a public spectacle that unfolded in the cold, unforgiving glare of the media. The story was irresistible. A wealthy, prominent family, pillars of their community, revealed to be not just common fraudsters, but operators in a sophisticated international money laundering ring. And the cherry on top, the detail that captivated the public, was the audacious, cruel attempt to frame their own daughter, a daughter who turned out to be a decorated federal agent. News vans camped outside the gates of their sprawling estate, filming as FBI agents carried out box after box of evidence. The society pages that once fawned over Helen's charity events now ran unflattering photos of her in handcuffs, her face streaked with tears, a stark contrast to her usually flawless composure. The business journals that had lauded Mark as a rising star now dissected his failures and criminal dealings with journalistic glee. The family name, once a symbol of success and old money, became synonymous with scandal and betrayal. Their friends and associates, the ones who had filled their home for lavish parties and clapped Robert on the back at the country club, vanished like mist. Calls went unanswered. Invitations were rescinded. The social architecture that had supported their lives crumbled overnight. They were pariahs, their story a cautionary tale whispered over cocktails and boardroom lunches. Robert, denied bail due to the severity of the charges and his potential as a flight risk, withered in federal custody. Stripped of his tailored suits and commanding presence, he seemed to shrink, becoming just another old man in a drab jumpsuit, his face etched with the terror of a future spent in a world he had only ever looked down upon. Helen, granted a compassionate release on house arrest with an ankle monitor, became a prisoner in her own gilded cage. The house that had been her stage was now her cell, its opulent rooms echoing with silence and shame. The staff quit, the caterers stopped calling, and the silence was broken only by the incessant ringing of phones from reporters she refused to answer. Mark, facing the most serious charges, took a plea deal. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he agreed to testify against the Eastern European syndicate his family had been laundering money for. His confession was a damning, detailed account of their crimes, a final, desperate act of self-preservation that also served as the final nail in his parents' coffins. He spared no one, laying bare the years of deceit, the greed, the moral compromises that had led them to this point. His testimony painted a pathetic picture of a man drowning in his own ambition, willing to sacrifice anyone, including his own sister, to stay afloat. During her debriefing, Kim was required to read the transcripts of his confession. She did so in a sterile, windowless room, the clinical language of the document a bizarre filter for the deeply personal betrayal it described. Reading Mark's words, his justifications, his fear, his casual dismissal of her as collateral damage, was a strange and numbing experience. It was like reading an autopsy report of a relationship that had died long before she even realized it was sick. He spoke of a lifelong jealousy, of his resentment of her quiet independence, which he had always misinterpreted as a judgment on his own life of frantic, performative success. He confessed that framing her wasn't just practical. A small, dark part of him had enjoyed the idea of bringing his enigmatic, untouchable sister down to his level. The Bureau offered her a therapist, a kind-faced woman named Dr. Alves, who specialized in trauma and high-stress professions. In their sessions, Kim found herself able to articulate the complex swirl of emotions she had kept locked away. It wasn't anger that consumed her, but a profound and hollow sense of loss. "They were my family," she said in one session, the words feeling foreign in her mouth. "There's a history there, birthdays, holidays, a whole lifetime of shared memories. But it feels like that history belongs to a different person, like I'm reading a novel about someone else's life." Dr. Alves nodded. "The person you were in that family, the role you played, was a fiction they created for you. And the family you thought you had was a fiction you created for yourself to survive. The grief you're feeling is real. You're mourning the loss of that illusion, and that's a death like any other." Kim was commended for her bravery and professionalism. She was offered a promotion, a desk job in a major city, far from the field, a reward for her ordeal. She respectfully declined. The field was where she belonged. Anonymity was her armor and her work was her purpose. She requested a transfer to a different region, a place with no history, no ghosts. Before she left, she performed one last act of closure. She drove to her family's house. She didn't go to the door. She just parked across the street, looking at the familiar facade. The cherry blossoms her mother had used to lure her home were gone, replaced by the heavy green leaves of summer. The house looked smaller, somehow, less imposing. It was no longer a monument to power, but a mausoleum of bad choices. She watched for a few minutes, feeling nothing but a quiet finality, then put the car in drive and pulled away without looking back. The courtroom was a theater of quiet devastation. Kim was not required to attend, but she watched the sentencing from a secure government feed, a silent observer to the final act of her family's tragedy. Her father, Robert, stood before the judge, a shrunken, humbled version of the Titan she had known. He received a sentence of 15 years in a federal prison. He didn't weep or rage. He simply nodded, his face slack with resignation, the fight completely gone from him. Helen, whose charges were slightly less severe but whose complicity was undeniable, was sentenced to 7 years. She collapsed into a fit of hysterical sobs, her carefully maintained dignity shattering into a million pieces on the cold marble floor of the courtroom. Her cries were not of remorse, but of a woman who could not fathom a world without her social standing, her freedom, her comfort. It was the wail of a queen being cast out of her own kingdom. Mark, due to his cooperation, received a sentence of 10 years. He stood tall, his face a mask of stoicism, and when the judge asked if he had anything to say, he turned and looked directly at the courtroom camera, as if he knew she was watching. "I want to apologize to my sister," he said, his voice cracking for the first time. "I did an unforgivable thing. I was a coward and I was cruel and I will spend the rest of my life ying to understand how I became the person who could do that. I hope, one day, she finds peace." The words hung in the air, a too little, too late attempt at redemption. Kim felt a flicker of something, a dull ache in her chest, but it wasn't forgiveness. It was just the sad acknowledgement of a profound and irreparable waste. After the sentencing, she was finally allowed to see them one last time. It was not her choice. It was a recommendation from her therapist, Dr. Alves, who called it a final confrontation with the narrative. A way to close the book on her own terms. The meeting took place in a sterile, featureless room at the Federal Detention Center, the air thick with the smell of antiseptic and regret. They were brought in one by one. Her father was first. He sat opposite her, the table between them feeling like a chasm. He looked old and frail. "I don't know what to say, Kim," he began, his voice raspy. I am sorry. I let Mark's ambition, my own pride. I let it blind me. I should have protected you. That was my only job as a father, and I failed." Kim listened, her expression unreadable. "Why?" she asked, the same question she had asked herself 1,000 times. "Why me? You could have come up with any other plan." "Why was I the one you chose to sacrifice?" Robert looked down at his hands, chained at his waist. "Because it was easy," he whispered, the confession a gutting blow. "You were distant. You had a life we didn't understand. It made you other. It was easier to hurt someone we had already convinced ourselves we had lost." It was the most honest thing he had ever said to her. Her mother was next. Helen was a wreck, her face puffy and blotchy, her expensive clothes looking out of place and absurd in the grim surroundings. She began to cry the moment she sat down. "Kim, my baby," she sobbed. "You have to forgive me. I never wanted this. I was just trying to keep the family together, to protect your brother." "You weren't protecting him," Kim said, her voice cold and even. "You were enabling him. You were so invested in the idea of him as a success that you were willing to destroy me to maintain the illusion. Was it worth it?" Helen just wept, offering no answers, only a litany of self-pity and excuses. She saw herself as a victim of circumstance, a doting mother caught in a tragic storm. She had no capacity to see the wreckage she had created. The final confrontation was with Mark. He looked thinner, his face etched with the lines of stress and guilt. He sat down and didn't speak for a full minute, simply looking at her. "Your apology in court," Kim said, breaking the silence. "Did you mean it?" He nodded slowly. "Every word. Not that it matters. I know that. I know there's no coming back from what I did." He leaned forward, his eyes pleading. "I was drowning, Kim, in debt, in lies. The syndicate was going to kill me. I panicked. And in that panic, all the ugly things inside me, the jealousy I've had since we were kids, the resentment that you just walked away from all this pressure and seemed fine, it all came out. I told myself it was just a business decision. I didn't let myself think of you as my sister. I thought of you as a solution to a problem." "I was never the one who was fine, Mark," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I just learned how to hide the damage better." She stood up. She had heard enough. She had seen them for who they truly were, stripped of their wealth, their power, their carefully constructed facades. They were just flawed, weak people who had made monstrous choices. "Goodbye," she said, speaking to all of them, to the empty chair where her mother and father had sat, and to the brother who was now a stranger. "I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for." She walked out of the room without looking back, the sound of Mark calling her name fading behind her. She didn't feel triumph or the sweet satisfaction of revenge. She just felt an immense, aching emptiness, the hollow space where a family used to be. But as she stepped out of the detention center and into the bright, indifferent sunlight, she also felt something else, a sense of lightness. The weight of their expectations, their judgments, their lies was finally gone. She was free. Months bled into a year. The sensational story of her family's downfall eventually faded from the headlines, replaced by new scandals, new tragedies. The legal system ground on, moving them through its impersonal machinery. Their assets were seized and liquidated to pay off a mountain of debts and government fines. The grand house, the monument to their ambition, was sold at auction to a tech billionaire who promptly gutted it, erasing the last physical traces of her childhood. Kim thrived. She moved to a sprawling, anonymous city on the coast, taking a position as a lead field agent in a domestic counterterrorism unit. Her new life was Spartan and focused. Her apartment was small and neat, with few personal effects. Her possessions chosen for their utility, not their sentiment. Her work was demanding, consuming, and she was exceptionally good at it. She built a new family, a different kind of family, forged in the crucible of shared risk and mutual respect with her fellow agents. They were people who understood the necessity of secrets, the weight of a double life, the quiet comfort of trusting the person who had your back. They didn't know the details of her past, only that she was one of them, and that was enough. She rarely thought of her old family, but sometimes in the quiet moments between cases, a memory would surface unbidden. The smell of her mother's perfume, the sound of her father's booming laugh, the image of Mark as a boy, with a gap-toothed grin. These moments were like phantom limb pains, aches from something that had been amputated. They didn't cripple her, but they served as a constant reminder of the wound she carried. She learned to live with the scar. It became a part of her, a source of a quiet, hard-won strength. Her experience had given her a unique insight into the anatomy of deceit, the way greed could curdle a person's soul. It made her a better agent, more intuitive, more relentless in her pursuit of the truth. One evening, a letter arrived at her secure P.O. box. It was from a federal penitentiary in another state. The handwriting was her mother's, the familiar, elegant script now looking shaky and frail. For a long time, Kim just stared at the envelope, a war of emotions raging within her. Part of her wanted to burn it, to refuse this final intrusion into her new life. But another part, the part that Dr. Alves had encouraged her to listen to, knew she had to open it. It was the last page of the book. She sat by her window, looking out at the glittering, impersonal city lights, and read. The letter was not an apology. It was a rambling, self-pitying lament. Helen wrote of the indignities of prison life, the terrible food, the coarse women she was forced to associate with. She blamed Robert for being weak, Mark for being reckless, and in a twisted turn of logic, she even blamed Kim. "If you had just stayed home," she wrote, "if you had been a normal daughter and taken your place in the family business, none of this would have happened. Mark would have had your steadying influence. Your father would not have been under so much pressure. We could have been happy." Kim read the last line, and a single, dry laugh escaped her lips. Even now, after everything, her mother was still trying to cast her in a role in her own personal drama. The villain, the savior, the cause of all her problems. It was never about who Kim actually was. It was always about the part Helen needed her to play. She carefully folded the letter, walked to the small incinerator bin in her apartment, a standard piece of equipment for agents needing to dispose of sensitive documents, and dropped it in. She watched as the edges curled and blackened, the words of blame and delusion turning to gray, feathery ash. As the last ember died out, she felt a final, definitive click inside her, the sound of a door being locked for the last time. Her old life, her old family, was now nothing but smoke. She was not the person they had tried to create, nor the person they had tried to destroy. She was Special Agent Kim. She had survived. And in the quiet strength of that survival, she had found her own kind of justice and her own kind of peace. The end of one story is always the beginning of another. For Kim, the beginning was quiet and unassuming. It wasn't a grand, cinematic moment of triumph, but a series of small, ordinary days that, when strung together, formed the fabric of a new life. She found a strange comfort in routine. The early morning runs along the misty waterfront, the intense focus of the firing range, the late-night case files under the glow of a desk lamp. These were the rhythms that defined her existence now, a life built on discipline and purpose, a stark contrast to the chaotic, emotionally volatile world she had escaped. Her colleagues became her anchors. There was Davies, who had been promoted to a regional director and served as her mentor, a steady, guiding presence. There was Harris, the sharp, no-nonsense agent who had become her closest friend, their bond forged in shared danger and an unspoken understanding of the sacrifices their job demanded. They would have beers after a tough case, their conversation a mix of shop talk and guarded personal revelations. With them, Kim learned to trust again, not with the blind faith of a child, but with the measured confidence of a professional who knew her life was in capable hands. One day, while working on a complex financial fraud case that bore an unsettling resemblance to her family's crimes, she uncovered a detail others had missed, a tiny discrepancy in a set of accounts, a digital breadcrumb that seemed insignificant. But Kim's senses, honed by personal betrayal, screamed that it was important. She followed the thread, pulling on it relentlessly, unraveling a vast network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of a powerful corporation. Her work led to a series of high-profile arrests and earned her a director's citation for exceptional service. In the small ceremony, as Davies pinned the medal to her suit, He leaned in and whispered, "You see patterns no one else does. You turn your scars into weapons." It was the highest praise she could imagine. The ghosts of her past still visited her, but they had lost their power. They were no longer terrifying specters, but faded photographs in a book she had long since closed. The pain of their betrayal had been metabolized, transformed from a debilitating poison into a source of empathetic strength. She understood the darkness that could drive people to do terrible things, and it made her more determined than ever to stand in its way. Years passed. Her hair was now cut shorter, and there were fine lines around her eyes from years of intense focus and sleepless nights. She was a respected veteran in the bureau, a legend in some circles, known for her quiet demeanor and a frighteningly brilliant mind. She never married, never had children. Her life was her work, and she found a profound sense of fulfillment in it. Occasionally, she would receive a letter from a parole board informing her of a hearing for Robert or Helen or Mark. She always checked the box that said, "I do not wish to provide a statement," and sent it back. Their futures were their own to navigate. She had no more words for them. Her story was not one of revenge. Revenge was a hot, consuming fire, and what she felt was a cool, quiet peace. She had not destroyed her family. They had destroyed themselves with their own choices, their own greed and lies. She had simply refused to be a part of their implosion. She had chosen to live, to build something new from the rubble, to forge an identity that was entirely her own, defined not by her blood but by her actions. On the anniversary of her arrest, she didn't mourn or celebrate. She went to the firing range. With each perfectly placed shot, she reaffirmed her focus, her control, her purpose. She was not the victim of her past. She was the architect of her future. And as she reloaded, her hands steady and sure, she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be.